Jujutsu Kaisen made an appearance in Marvel Comics recently, particularly in the Storm comic. It was not a very lengthy instance, and it was simply Storm passing through that particular narrative. But this has led to a very lively debate online as to whether or not Marvel actually has a publicly confirmed Omniverse, which is a collection of multiverses. Now, Marvel is part of the Omniverse insofar as they are one of any number of forms of fiction that exist out here in the human world. But within the comics themselves, does Marvel actually reference an Omniverse, and have they referenced it before the events of the Storm comic? People have been posting different panels online where different characters like the Watcher or Captain Britain have made reference to the Omniverse. But oftentimes, those pieces of evidence are provided with no context whatsoever in terms of what's actually going on in Marvel at the time. And so what we're going to do over the course of this video is we're going to answer the question, does Marvel have a publicly confirmed Omniverse, or is everybody getting it wrong? And we're going to start going through these different comic book panels that people are referencing, providing some context to them, and going through the nature of Marvel's universes, megaverse, multiverse, and omniverse, and so on, to finally give an answer to this question. So let's start simple here. Let's start with the universe. Now, you guys don't necessarily need to be told what a universe is, right? It is a singular space that stretches on, and it has galaxies and stars and planets and sentient life and laser beams and photon torpedoes and Spider-Man, right? But within a singular universe, you have what are called pocket universes and pocket dimensions. So let's talk about pocket dimensions for a second. And for this example, we're going to use Asgard. So despite what the Marvel Cinematic Universe showed, which was that they just got into a rocket ship and flew to Nidavellir, it doesn't work that way in Marvel Comics. If you got into a rocket ship in the city of New York and fired off into space, flying to the edge of the universe, you would never reach Asgard. And the reason why is because Asgard is not some galaxy over there somewhere. Instead, Asgard is a pocket dimension. What it means is that you have to open some kind of dimensional doorway in order to get there. In the case of someone like Thor, he uses the Bifrost Bridge. Someone like Doctor Strange would use his powers to create a dimensional doorway, and someone like Reed Richards would use technology to create a doorway. But regardless of how you do it, you have to create an access point. Otherwise, you will never reach it. But then let's take that line of logic and apply it to something like the Dark Dimension. Now, where Asgard is considered a pocket dimension, the Dark Dimension is considered a pocket universe. Why? What's the difference between the two? Well, one, it's a matter of scale. The Dark Dimension is actually bigger than both Asgard and even the main Marvel Universe itself. I know it sounds crazy, but the best way to explain this is Harry Potter. When Harry went into the tent in the Goblet of Fire film, and the inside of the tent was bigger than the tent itself, that's what we're talking about here, defying all laws of physics. But the other reason why it's called a pocket universe is because it operates very similar to the main Marvel Universe itself, in the sense that at one point, the Dark Dimension was a singular place, and then some kind of conflict took place, and it led to the Dark Dimension shattering, and that created what we now call the Splinter Realms. And so when I say that it works very similar to the main Marvel Universe, this is what I mean. Now, when these Splinter Realms were created within Marvel, that's where you get the Fear Lords and Hell Lords. So the Dweller in Darkness, or someone like Mephisto, they all exist within their own pocket dimensions inside of this larger pocket dimension. So using our example of how you would travel to Asgard, opening a dimensional barrier, say for example that you did that and traveled to the Dark Dimension. It's not as though you could just look to your left and see Mephisto standing there waving at you, bidding you to come over so he can steal your soul. Or you would see the Dweller in Darkness over there looking to torment you for the rest of your existence. It would be just like Asgard in the main Marvel Universe, which is to say you open a dimensional barrier to get into the Dark Dimension, and then you have to open another dimensional barrier to get into the realm of Mephisto, or to go to the realm of the Dweller in Darkness, or even Nightmare. And so in that way, it functions very similar to a universe. But I've never really liked the term pocket universe. And the reason for that is because once you start referring to things as pocket universes, for the average person who exists out there and is not overly knowledgeable about Marvel Comics, they immediately think it's an alternate reality. But we know with the Dark Dimension, that's not the case. A good example of this is in the original Ultimate Universe, Earth 1610. That has its own version of the Dark Dimension, its own version of Dormammu. Pretty much every reality does. And so the Dark Dimension is unique. And so that's why I say the Dark Dimension is really just a really, really big pocket dimension. And I feel like it should just be referred to that way, but alas. I'm just one voice. And so with that out of the way, a multiverse is exactly what it sounds like. It's just an infinite number of universes. Now, within the Marvel multiverse, there are ways to access other universes through technology, dimensional barriers, or what have you. But there is also one universe in particular that can access every other universe. So let's talk about the first point, right? How do you access any other universe within the multiverse? Well, there's places like the Florida Everglades and the Nexus of all realities that's guarded by Man-Thing. There's quite literally a portal there. So if you go to the Florida Everglades and you don't burn at the touch of the Man-Thing because you're not afraid, you can pass through the Nexus of realities and end up in this crazy wonky Penrose Steps type place where you could actually start accessing other realities. That's how Marvel introduced Howard the Duck. He fell off one of the paths and landed in the main Marvel universe. And there are any number of other ways to access other realities. More recently, in Jonathan Hickman's Avengers and New Avengers runs, incursions was a way to do it, right? An alternate Earth shows up in the sky, you have to destroy one of the Earths or you'll both die. If you were to destroy your own Earth and hop onto that incursive Earth, you could actually ride that Earth to another universe and then jump onto that alternate reality. Now, you don't know what universe you would come across. It's far less precise than someone like Doctor Strange or even Reed Richards opening up a portal. Another really good example of this is that in Marvel Comics, you have something called the superflow. So if you imagine the multiverse to be a brick wall and each one of the bricks was a universe, the mortar between the bricks is the superflow. Now, unless you're someone like Reed Richards who is knowledgeable enough about the multiverse to know how to navigate it, you would literally just be riding the tide and you'd have no idea where you would end up or what universe you would be in. But as long as you know what you're doing, you can actually travel the superflow and travel from one universe to the next. Now that's when you start running into beings like the many angled ones who exist in the space between universes as well. These are guys like Shuma Gorath. He's considered a mini angled one. If you guys remember the Thanos Imperative storyline and how the Cancerverse was corrupted after Mistress Death was killed, that universe was corrupted by the many angled ones. They used Doctor Strange to enter and then took over everything. If you don't know what I'm talking about, not a huge deal. Doesn't take away from the conversation. But if you do, a nice little Easter egg. But beyond all of this, and as far as that one universe goes that can access any universe across the multiverse, this is called the negative zone. Now, the funny thing about it is that if you're familiar with the Fantastic Four in the original Ultimate Universe in Earth 1610, they had what was called the end zone, which was basically Marvel's attempt to establish there were multiple versions of the negative zone. That ultimately went away. And the negative zone was essentially codified within Marvel as being one universe that anybody can access and then access any other universe across the multiverse from the negative zone. More recently, that was confirmed in Annihilation Scourge, when the Sentry ended up in the negative zone, and then you ended up seeing beings from the Cancerverse and Thanos Imperative in the negative zone itself. So they had literally left their universe, traveled into the negative zone, and that's where Sentry met them. But again, I simply say all that to say, there's any number of ways in Marvel Comics to access alternate realities. Magic or science or someone like Reed Richards who has a portal to the negative zone, right? These are all ways that you can access alternate universes, and there's more than that, right? But beyond the multiverse, you have what's called a megaverse. Now, I don't like the term megaverse, and the reason why is because it's basically a temporary answer to why some universes exist, and Marvel's never bothered to get rid of it. And the reason why I say that is this. So Marvel has had crossovers, intercompany crossovers over the years with other comic book publishers. There has been Malibu Comics when you had the Avengers Ultra Force crossover. That's the story that you guys may have heard of, where Loki travels to another universe, finds a seventh Infinity Stone called the Ego Stone, and then brings it back. But the best example of this is Marvel versus DC and the Amalgam universe. So for those of you guys who are familiar with the crossover right now, but you don't really know the history of it, Marvel and DC started crossing over back in the 80s, and Superman and Spider-Man were the first time it happened. But it's not as though Spider-Man left the Marvel universe and went to the DC universe, or vice versa. Superman leaving the DC universe and going to the Marvel universe. Instead, this crossover universe treated Superman and Spider-Man as if they'd always lived there. And so Marvel had to have a way to explain that, right? If DC has its own multiverse and Marvel has its own multiverse, how do you reconcile the existence of a universe where these characters have always existed? That became exacerbated when you went into Marvel versus DC. And then you saw the introduction of the brothers. Now, where we were not originally given an explanation of how they came into existence, the brothers were immensely powerful. One of them represented everything that is Marvel Comics. The other represented everything that's DC Comics. And they ultimately went to war against each other. And that was how how Marvel and DC created their crossover event. Now, this brings in any number of questions about how the one above all or the presence factor into that. As far as I'm aware, neither Marvel nor DC ever bothered to answer those questions. And honestly, it's really not that important. What ended up happening is the year after the Marvel-DC crossover happened, we actually ended up getting a comic called Adventures of the X-Men. That was actually a comic that largely focused on the previous iteration of the universe and the multiverse and how it came to an end. However, there is one particular panel in that comic book where the Living Tribunal makes reference to the creation of the brother within the Marvel-DC crossover event. And I'm not aware of Marvel ever referencing it again outside of that, but it simply just indicates the fact that the brother that represents Marvel was created by the Living Tribunal. I imagine on some level it was designed to reconcile how this crossover could happen with both Marvel and DC. Again, I'm not aware of Marvel having referenced it since then. But the fact is, there needed to be a way to explain how a universe like that could exist. Because what ends up happening at the end of Marvel DC is that a character by the name of Access comes into existence, and that leads to the creation of the Amalgam Universe. The Amalgam Universe was basically a reality where Marvel and DC characters were merged together. So for example, Batman merges with Wolverine, and you get a character named Darkclaw. Well again, if DC has its multiverse and Marvel has its multiverse, but this is somehow a reality that blends the two of them, how do you reconcile that? Hence, Megaverse was born. Now, the funny thing about the Amalgam Universe is that even to this day, it still gets referenced occasionally, but no one ever really does anything meaningful with it, so seemingly it doesn't seem to matter at all. The character of Access hasn't really been seen since 1997. Amalgam did seem to return during the Dark Crisis on Infinite Earth storyline, but that's not really confirmed until you get to the Flash tie-in, where Barry Allen had actually traveled throughout the multiverse, and at the very end of the comic, there's a listing of all the universes that he had visited, and one of them is Earth 1996, which is the Amalgam Universe. Now, he essentially says that he wants to investigate it at some point in time, but that's it. But because of the fact that DC references it, it still seems to exist in some capacity. So your mileage may vary on whether or not that actually matters. Now, beyond universes and the megaverse, you have the multiverse. And this is where you start getting into debates between multiverse and omniverse. Because when you start looking at individual comic books, you actually start to realize what's being talked about here. So a really good example, and probably one of the most popular examples of this being used online, is from Quasar number 31, when the Watcher is talking to Wendell Vaughn, and the Watcher tells him, "You left the multiverse, I could not see you. Did you travel into the Omniverse?" And at that point, Wendell says he doesn't really know, but he did meet somebody from New Universe. Well, that was Starbrand, by the way. And as a quick explanation here, New Universe was introduced in Marvel Comics by Jim Shooter as basically a 25th anniversary celebration of Marvel. Quite literally, it was supposed to be a reboot in the mid to late 1980s. No doubt, it was inspired by DC Comics' Crisis on Infinite Earths. But New Universe currently exists as part of the Marvel Multiverse, and it's actually designated Earth 148611. But the nature of New Universe is that it didn't really have any superheroes in the traditional sense. It was just an answer to the question, what would happen if regular people suddenly found themselves endowed with powers? What would their lives look like? How would they use those powers? And what would the consequences of those powers be? Especially if all the powers kind of have to work in unison. Can they come together as a group? In concept, New Universe was dope. In execution, it had all kinds of problems. I still say Warren Ellis, I believe it was Warren Ellis who relaunched it in the mid-2000s. His version of New Universe is fantastic. And in fact, during Jonathan Hickman's Avengers and New Avengers run, because some of you guys may recognize the name Starbrand, Jonathan Hickman took that concept and yanked it right out of New Universe and threw it into the main Marvel Universe, which is how you get a Starbrand within the main Marvel Universe. But the fact remains, while it may not have been considered part of the main Marvel Universe at that point in time, it is now. Another really good example of this is in the Daredevils. No, it's not really a Daredevil story, but it also kind of is. This was part of Marvel UK. And for those of you guys who don't know about that, Marvel UK was Marvel Comics' attempt to expand out into the British audience so that when they were eating their baked beans for breakfast, call it heavy spoilers, they could read comic books. And so the Daredevils was actually a tie-in to a larger storyline known as the Crooked World. And anybody who is familiar with this knows exactly what kind of a tear I'm about to go on. This is the story that introduced and focused on a character named Mad Jim Jaspers. Essentially, the first half of the story takes place in Earth 238, which is a universe where a guy named Jim Jaspers had the ability to alter reality. He ends up creating this incredibly advanced robot known as the Fury, and the Fury starts traveling across the entirety of Earth, wiping out every single superhero in existence. Something to point out, this is long before the days of Dan Abnett reconciling all of Marvel's cosmology and then bringing in like Guardians of the Galaxy and stuff like that. And so at this point, Marvel's cosmic landscape is patchwork at best, not unified in any meaningful sense. And so the Captain Britain of that universe ends up fleeing that reality and showing up in the main Marvel universe. And that's when you end up finding out that Merlin, the guardian of the Omniverse, has tasked Brian Braddock, the Captain Britain of the main Marvel universe, with traveling to this reality and confronting Jim Jaspers. And he gets his ass handed to him. It's crazy. But the reason why it's called the Crooked World is because what you had during this time was something called the Omniversal Development Court. Its job was to monitor the entirety of existence and to make sure that every single universe effectively followed something akin to the same form and function, which means it evolved the way it was supposed to. Every universe had a version of the X-Men or the Fantastic Four or the Avengers or something along those lines. And if it didn't, they would initiate something called the Push, which was literally jump-starting the evolution of that world. Well, because they didn't know that Jim Jaspers had killed everybody, they thought there was a world with no superheroes because Jim Jaspers kept his powers hidden. And that led to them initiating the Push. That pisses off Jaspers and he initiates the Warp. And it starts twisting and distorting all of reality like a reality distortion tornado, to the point that in Daredevils, you had a guy by the name of Lord Mandragon. And this is where the nature of the Omniverse comes into play. Because when he talks about everything happening in Earth 238, he says, "My scientific advisors have informed me that the breakdown of reality, which afflicts Earth 238, is rapidly spreading to other worlds in its continuum. Soon, the entire universe, which that luckless Earth resides in, will be contaminated, and unchecked, the blight may spread to other universes. As you know, it is within my power, in certain extreme circumstances, to have a given universe removed should its existence threaten the Omniverse. Thus, it is with a heavy heart," and then of course it's objected, but it doesn't really matter. He ends up destroying the entirety of the Earth 238 universe. But contextually, he's not talking about an omniverse. He's not saying that the Jaspers Warp will spread beyond his universe into the multiverse and then into the omniverse. No, what he's saying is it'll spread into the multiverse. So this is one of those instances. Omniverse and multiverse are basically the same thing. Marvel was just calling it Omniverse back then. Now, that takes us into Young Avengers issue number 14. It essentially retconned America Chavez and the nature of the utopian parallel. What you guys may or may not know is that when it came to America Chavez, the way she was originally introduced is that the utopian parallel was the place she came from and that it existed outside of the multiverse. Now, that does not mean that it's part of a greater omniverse. There are places outside of the multiverse, and we'll talk about that here in a minute. Now, in Young Avengers number 14, it established the idea that the utopian parallel, the home of America Chavez, was no longer being dragged into the common multiverse, which seemed to validate the fact that it existed outside of the multiverse. But then in Made in America, this was retconned to establish that she never actually came from a place outside of the multiverse, and the utopian parallel wasn't real. That the reality is she got her powers due to experimentation on an island somewhere. And that was basically it. Right now, whether or not you like this retcon is entirely on you. But at the end of the day, even referencing this, a lot of people would use it as evidence to show that because it existed outside of the multiverse, that it was somehow part of the larger omniverse. But nothing about the utopian parallel as it's shown indicates that it's part of another multiverse. It's simply just a place beyond the multiverse. But let's talk about that for a second. Let's talk about realms that exist outside of the multiverse within Marvel Comics. So I do want to specify we're using Al Ewing's Ultimates run to talk about this? Well, technically it's Ultimates, and then it's Defenders and Defenders Beyond. The reason why we're going with that is because it's really the most recent instance where anybody at Marvel has bothered to consolidate the various places that exist beyond the multiverse in Marvel Comics. It actually provides a kind of layered approach to all of this. So the first place here is what's called the Far Shore, and this is also known as the Graveyard of Realities. The reason being because, as you guys know, realities are born and realities die. It was a little bit of a finicky approach because we had always kind of assumed that realities would essentially implode on themselves, or they would be blown to smithereens or something along those lines, right? You could use an ultimate nullifier to make it as if a reality never existed, in which case it's a sum. We know Earth 238 was destroyed during the Crooked World storyline, but there's also been what-if stories where Jean Grey, for example, became the Dark Phoenix and destroyed her entire reality. The way that Al Ewing presented the Far Shore was that whenever a reality ends, there are remnants of it that somehow get left behind for one reason or another. Those remnants are confined to the Far Shore. So it kind of operates as a cosmic prison or a multiversal prison to a degree, both because of the remnants that do exist there from destroyed realities, but also because people and beings can be confined there. A really good example of this is the first firmament. So in Marvel Comics, during Al Ewing's Ultimates run, what he introduced was the idea that presumably it was created by the One Above All, although we don't know for sure. But before the multiverse ever existed, the first form of existence was called the first firmament, the first universe. And the first universe created aspirants, and the aspirants in turn within the first universe started creating planets and life and so on and so forth. But the aspirants had a kind of dogmatic loyalty, a religious fervor to the first firmament, but not all of them did. Some of the aspirants broke off, changed their colors, and started calling themselves Celestials, and that led to a war between the aspirants and the Celestials. The war was so severe that at its conclusion, the first firmament was shattered, and that led to the creation of the first multiverse. Now, seemingly, the shattered pieces were finite, but as you guys know, when it comes to alternate realities in Marvel, there's always two scenarios. What if a thing happens, and what if it doesn't happen? What if Peter gets bitten by a radioactive spider? That's the main Marvel universe. What if he doesn't? That's an alternate reality. And so as you can imagine, any and all possibilities that exist in any and all realities can quickly add up to an infinite number of universes, quite literally an infinitely expanding web of alternate realities. And that's exactly what happened. And so following the creation of the first multiverse, the Celestials having been the victors, and with the first firmament and the remaining aspirants confined to the Far Shore, the Celestials started duplicating themselves and putting a version of themselves in each and every universe across the multiverse. So that's how you get Celestials in every reality. But I simply say that to say that in the aftermath of the Celestial War, the first firmament and the aspirants were confined to the Far Shore. But beyond the Far Shore, you have what's called the Beyond Realm. Now, this one is certainly a retcon, and the reason why is because a lot of you guys are probably aware of the Beyonders in Marvel Comics. When they were originally presented to us in Marvel, they existed in the Beyondverse. And in fact, the Beyondverse itself served a very particular purpose beyond housing the Beyonders. A lot of you guys have heard of cosmic cubes. Cosmic cubes are the result of what happens when you open a portal to the Beyondverse and siphon off some of that energy, whether intentional or not. And that energy goes inside the cube. And so whenever you're wielding a cosmic cube, you're quite literally wielding a fraction of the power of Beyonders. It's why, depending on the nature of the story, you could argue that a cosmic cube is more powerful than the Infinity Gauntlet, because the Infinity Gauntlet allows you to manipulate the fundamental laws of the universe. A cosmic cube allows you to break them. At the same time, we also didn't really know where the Beyonders came from. What Al Ewing did in this great big huge retcon in Defenders Beyond is he established that in the aftermath of the war between the Celestials and the Aspirants, in order to ensure a war like that never happened again, the Celestials created the Beyonders and then placed them outside of the multiverse itself, so that if some kind of a multiversal war among all the Celestials, or if the first firmament and the Aspirants were to return, that the Beyonders could step in and end that war. Now, that was also Al Ewing basically offering up the character of Enigma, and that's why the Beyonders wanted to destroy everything during Hickman's Avengers and New Avengers as part of his lead up to Secret Wars 2015. That was not a very well received aspect of the retcon, just FYI. And when I say that, I mean, I didn't like it. So I also assume nobody else liked it. But the fact is, this is what you might call the second layer of the space beyond the multiverse. After that, you have what's called the White Hot Room. This is the home of the Phoenix Force. Now, this is a whole explanation that we could have. And in fact, I do have videos from, I don't know, 10, 11, 12 years ago, where I did talk about the nature of the Phoenix Force. And truth to tell, they're still relevant because not much has changed in terms of the form and function of the Phoenix since those videos were made. Maybe the nature of the White Hot Room, but that's it. But when it comes to Marvel Comics, the Phoenix Force exists across all of creation, everything that has ever, currently does, or will ever exist. But much like the Living Tribunal, there's only one Phoenix Force across all of creation. And so when you see alternate realities where someone becomes a host for a Phoenix, it's simply just the Phoenix Force providing them with a small portion of its power. For the character of Jean Grey, most of you guys know she is the preeminent host of the Phoenix within Marvel. But what casual comic book fans may not know is that there is what's called the White Phoenix of the Crown. And that's when Jean Grey basically channels the full totality of the Phoenix Force's powers. In Grant Morrison's Here Comes Tomorrow, we got to see what that looks like, which is to say, when Jean has the totality of those abilities, she can create or destroy any universe she wants to. Now, more recently, Stephanie Phillips kind of provided us with a new version of the Phoenix that seemed to be more powerful than the White Phoenix of the Crown, but the reality is we didn't really see her do anything that rivaled the power of the White Phoenix of the Crown. She was struggling against Gore the God Butcher, for God's sake. Like, I have a hard time believing that version of Phoenix has the ability to wipe out all of existence on the same level that the White Phoenix of the Crown does. Now, maybe she was simply holding her power back, right? But whatever the reason happens to be, the White Phoenix of the Crown version of Jean is still by and large considered the most powerful version of Jean Grey. The White Hot Room is where she resides, but the White Hot Room serves more purposes than that. It can serve as a way station, which is to say you can just put things there. We saw that at the end of Fall of X, that the island of Krakoa and a lot of the mutants that existed there were actually transitioned to the White Hot Room. It was just a way for Marvel to just sit them over there in a closet until they decide to use them again and then take them out like Christmas decorations in the Marvel Universe, right? But it's also important to know that the White Hot Room also takes on different appearances relative to the people who were there. So you could travel there with someone and you would both see two completely different iterations of what the White Hot Room looks like. One of you may see an endless desert that stretches on into infinity. The other person may see an endless icy landscape. There's no guarantee you'll see the same things. You probably will, but there's no guarantee that you will. But beyond the White Hot Room, you have what's called the land of couldn't be, shouldn't be. This is basically just a realm of possibilities. And when I say the realm of possibilities, I mean exactly that. Anything that can possibly happen exists within this realm as a concept. It usually exists as an empty void, but is occupied by a being called the Queen of Nevers. Now, you don't really see her all that often within Marvel, but she's more of a metatextual character than anything else, which is to say her chief ability is basically probability manipulation. So she sees everything that could possibly happen from one moment to the next regarding anything and everything in existence. So if you're walking down the sidewalk in New York City and you happen to come across the Queen of Nevers and you ask her what's going to happen next, she'll give you like an infinite number of possibilities, right? Maybe a bird craps on you. Maybe a squirrel runs by and pees on you. Maybe a satellite falls on your head like Donnie Darko. Maybe you get hit by a car. Maybe the city of New York explodes in an atomic blast. There's any number of things that could go on. She represents all of that. In fact, technically she started out as the fourth iteration of the multiverse, but then ended up transitioning to the role that she has now. But because of the nature of her character, again, there isn't really a need for her within Marvel Comics all that often. And so again, you just never really see her that much. But that takes us into what's called the House of Ideas. This is the home of the One Above All. It's designed to be a in-comic book allegory for basically Marvel itself, right? The writers, the editors, C.B. Cebulski as editor-in-chief, and more often than not, the One Above All is presented as Jack Kirby, considering the fact that Jack Kirby is the chief reason why pretty much all the characters in Marvel exist as they do now. And so as you can imagine, the One Above All is supremely powerful. Now again, one of the things that Al Ewing had done in Defenders Beyond is he had introduced the idea of Enigma and simply saying that the One Above All is just a whole new level of cosmic entity that we weren't aware of before. And that idea did not last very long. I have to imagine that most of it is because of the fact that, number one, it kind of defies the name the One Above All if you're not the one above all. And number two, because of the first reason, it doesn't quite have the same ring to refer to him as the one above most. Doesn't quite hit the same way. So Marvel got rid of that quick, fast, and in a hurry. But again, something that I also want to specify here is we're talking about dimensional layers. And so wrapping all this up, while Marvel has referred to the existence of an Omniverse within their comics, the reality here is that Omniverse and Multiverse have historically always been interchangeable terms. That sure, you do have groups like the Omniversal Development Court, you do have Merlin and Roma as the Omniversal Guardian or the Omniversal Magistrix, but the reality here is that even with intercompany crossovers outside of Marvel and DC, using the Avengers Ultraforce crossover as an example, that crossover happened in 1995. Ultraforce is a Malibu property. Malibu was purchased by Marvel in 1994. So by the time the crossover happened, you technically had the main Marvel universe, Earth 616, crossing over with an alternate reality, Earth 93060, which is the Ultraforce reality. But this is the reason why the Storm comic is so important when it comes to the idea of an Omniverse, because it's the first time that we're seeing a character from Marvel Comics cross over in any capacity with other universes that are not and will probably never be owned by Marvel, meaning it's the first real time that Marvel is acknowledging franchises outside of itself, outside of maybe like Easter eggs or something along those lines. Seeing Storm pass through Jujutsu Kaisen means that Marvel is now acknowledging it exists alongside Jujutsu Kaisen. So hopefully this clears up a lot of stuff for you guys, at the very least the whole multiverse and omniverse debate. Let me know if you guys have any questions down below. Thank you all for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.